Ladies and gentlemen, we have today in the studios with us Dr. Reed Sheftall. And let me just give you a little information about him. I believe that it would be beneficial. He's an MIT physics major, former instructor in physics at the University of Southern California, and he's done about 50 hours, he says, on mistake-free videos on COVID-19. And Dr. Sheftall is a heart surgeon, plastic surgeon, and I could give you a list as long as my arm of his biographics and his background and his standing. But I'm delighted to have him again with us today as we talk about the subject, COVID update. Dr. Sheftall, if you would take just a minute, for those that may not have heard you before, just give a few moment thumbnail sketch, elevator speech as I call it, about you, your background, your passion, what you're doing, and you might even want to tuck in something about your book, Sanctioned, The COVID Murders.
Thank you, Dr. Youngblood. I appreciate you having me on once again, and you thought of the great idea that we would do COVID updates for our audience as often as we can get together.
Yes.
And I think they really appreciate that because this is an ongoing thing,
Yes.
obviously. I have so much to say today. I hope we have enough time. My background is exactly as you just summarized it, and you did a great job. And I'd like to jump right in on this very important point you're making here at the beginning, because to me, it's another example of medical tyranny. For them to be able to slip a fancy word into a consent when everybody's nervous before surgery, and they don't usually read them anyway, they just sign them. I can tell you that as a surgeon. That's horrible, because people don't know what biogenics means. They don't know what biologics mean, which encompasses vaccines also.
Yes.
Term. And to think that they would be injected while they're under anesthesia because the word was slipped in when they were asked to sign a 4-page consent is horrible.
Yes.
Like I say, it's medical tyranny. It's just gotten out of control. The whole of COVID was medical tyranny, locking down healthy people, making people wear masks that covered both ways that we breathe and the ways that we express ourselves, is medical tyranny. And one thing that upset me very much recently was watching the Senate hearings with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. I was shocked at the, let's call it, scientific illiteracy of the senators.
Yes.
I mean, they're calling it mRNA instead of modified RNA. Modified RNA, of course, refers to the pseudo-uridination of uracil residues on messenger RNA, which made the element that translates into proteins last months instead of minutes, which it normally lasts, normal messenger RNA. And that's nature's way of, if there's an error that's made, it's over in a few minutes anyway. And yet the modified RNA is still in the blood circulating of a lot of people that got the vaccines years ago. It also causes frame shifting, which makes nonsense proteins, and we don't know anything about the toxicity of those proteins. And the senators, especially Senator Bennett, but all of them, even the ones that were previously doctors, we're talking about how safe the vaccines are. It just blew my mind. I couldn't believe it. They're so unsafe, it's incredible, and the statistics bear that out.
Absolutely, and I have found even today, somewhat after COVID, as we really understand it, and the tyranny of that, as you call it, I'm amazed at the number of physicians today that will still talk about you need your vaccines, you need your vaccines. Tell our listeners what's in a COVID vaccination.
Oh boy. Well, it's funny you mention that because we still don't know the nucleotide sequence that was in the Moderna vaccine. Kevin McKernan, another MIT guy, sequenced the plasmids that were in the Pfizer Comirnaty vaccine, and he found SV40 promoters and enhancers. And let me just quickly explain to the audience what those are. Those came from simian vacuolating virus. Okay, it's a monkey virus that contaminated polio vaccines back in the 1950s.
Yes.
And they put them in the plasmids that were used to make messenger RNA for the vaccines. And that was a horrible criminal act also, because they got the approval for the vaccines by using the PCR amplification process. Once they got the approval, then they switched to a different process to make the products that they marketed, and they never tested the marketed products. I realized that when it was happening and made a big to-do about it in my videos back then. And I recently watched the ACIP meeting, and ACIP stands for Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. That's the committee that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. fired all of the old people off of, if you remember recently.
Yeah, that's right.
And it was a big controversy. But he replaced it with some very good people. And in the meeting that I watched, which is 6 hours long in preparation for today, a Dr. Wafiq El-Diri was going over the differences between the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines, which is very important because a lot of people out there want to know which one was more dangerous, what are the differences, etc., because they may have either gotten Pfizer or Moderna, and they'd like to know in particular what's dangerous about their vaccine. So we can talk about the differences if you'd like to. But getting back to the SV40 promoters and enhancers, those things can get into they're delivered to the cells by the lipid nanoparticles, of course, because that's how the modified RNA gets into the cells, right? Remember the lipid nanoparticles. And when a SV40 promoter gets into the cell and gets into the nucleus, which you can do via the enhancer, if it gets put in the wrong place on our DNA, like, for example, right in front of an oncogene, right? This is a gene that causes cancer. If the promoter gets right in front of that oncogene will be expressed, whereas normally it's dormant. It doesn't get expressed. And so it can cause cancer. Now, the reason that Pfizer put that thing in the plasmids is beyond me. And nobody understands why they put it in there, unless they had some nefarious purpose for doing so. They are not in the Moderna vaccine. So if you got the Modernas, you don't have the SV40 promoters and enhancers in your vaccine. But there are other problems with Moderna. The nanograms per dose are much, much higher in Moderna than they are in Pfizer. And that's why a lot of countries, especially in Northern Europe, took Moderna off the market way back when.
Didn't we officially at one point in time do the same with Moderna in America?
Oh, take it off the market?
Right.
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
They have stopped some of the vaccines along the way because of certain complications.
Okay.
I remember the Johnson & Johnson vaccine was taken off the market for a while, etc. Now, in one of the appendices of my books, appendix number 1, is a 9-page list of complications after only one dose of Pfizer, and it is scary to read. There's all sorts of neurological complications that occur. I'm talking about 9 pages of single-space complications, which are very, very
Do you recall
scary.
the number on that? I recall looking at the book. I forgot.
There's over 1,000 complications.
I think it's about 1,300.
1,300, yeah. Right. It's after one dose of Pfizer. Can you believe it? And people think these things are safe, and all these senators in that meeting I was talking about with Robert F. Kennedy were saying, we know it's safe and effective, like Senator Bennett, I mean.
I'm amazed when they say that, and I recall so distinctly the Marxist media, all of those, the Socialist, Marxist, Communist Party that's called Democrats, most of those that were making the decision and prompting, promoting, and pushing for the general public, isn't it true that they were not required to take the shot?
Oh, yeah, they're not required.
Yeah.
There's a list of about 15 entities that were not required to take the vaccine, including the employees of Pfizer and Moderna.
Wonder why?
Congress, including the representatives and senators, their staffs were not required. People at the White House were not required to take it. Isn't that incredible? And they mandated it on the general population.
On the general population.
And then they're sitting there saying it's safe and effective when I can prove you 15 or 20 different ways it's not safe at all.
In fact, that's what you talk about, I believe, in your book that's entitled Sanction, subtitled The COVID Murders. Take a moment to just give a sketchy overview of what that book is about. And by the way, it can be found on conservative.edu. Scroll down to the bookstore, and we have those in stock on the shelf. Love to have you get them. But Dr. Sheftall, tell our listeners a little about that book.
Okay, it's a book that I wrote to let the public know what was really done to them. Really and truly was done to them. And it's loaded with shocking revelations. The biggest shock, I think, to the public, and a lot of people don't believe me, but I can prove it very easily, is that there was never a SARS-2 virus. That was completely made up. There was no lab leak. The people that were behind this would never have risked something leaking. That's a random event that could have occurred 4 or 5 months later, or 5 years later, or 50 years later, a leak. And so they would never leave it up to a leak. The only possibility would be deliberate release, right?
Right.
Because remember, the reason
That's my contention, yes.
the reason that this happened was to hurt Trump's chances of getting reelected. Remember, Trump was going to win the next term in a landslide. Inflation was below 2%. Gas was below $2 a gallon. You can look it up. It's all a matter of record. There was a crisis in the cash markets in September of 2019, and they needed an excuse for injecting a lot of cash into the system to rescue the cash markets. And they used the so-called pandemic for that. There was a desire to not let people assemble, and so they came up with this pandemic so that they could tell people they weren't allowed to assemble. Remember, they weren't even allowed to go to church and so forth.
Supposedly, we had church.
Yeah, I know you broke the rules, and I'm proud of you for it. You're amazing. You do everything right. But, ladies and gentlemen, this is such a serious subject. The government really took advantage of the people. And, excuse me, let me take a drink of water because I'm getting treated for cancer. And it dries my mouth out terribly. But the revelation that there was never a virus is what's so fundamental to the whole thing. The entire thing was made up. And so if there's no virus, there's no COVID-19. It was a rebranding of other diseases, such as the flu.
Common flu.
Yeah. And if you look at the numbers of the cases of the flu in 2019 worldwide, it was 38 million. And in 2020, it was only 1,500. And so that's a reduction.
Magically, the common flu disappeared, didn't it?
Yes, it basically disappeared. It's a reduction ratio of 25,333. So it's just absurd to think. Let's see, I don't know how to say this. It's absurd to think that the flu just disappeared like that.
That's right.
It's ridiculous. From 38 million down to 1,500. So anyway, and by the way, the number of cases of COVID in 2020 was 32 million. So you sort of see where those cases came from. It was just a rebranding of the flu.
Dr. Sheftall, I've had an article here that is dated December the 9th, 2021. And I'm sure you're familiar with this. And it says in the article, today marks the launch of my newsletter on Substack. I'm Dr. Reed Sheftall, surgeon, MIT physics major, and former instructor of physics with the University of Southern California. And it goes on to say, I wrote to the host of Fox News, Tucker Carlson and Sean Hannity, and CNN, Anderson Cooper and Chris Cuomo, to notify them of my concerns, asking for just 10 minutes in which to explain to them but received no reply.
Right.
Talk about that for a minute.
Yeah, that was at the very beginning.
Yes.
And it was in 2020, wasn't it? Or did I put a typo down?
2021.
I meant 2020.
Okay.
It was at the very beginning of it. And I wrote them not to get on TV, because I told them I don't want to be on TV. I just want 10 minutes in your office, and then you can take the credit for it. But these lockdowns that the president is telling us we're going to be going into pretty soon, remember they would be over by Easter. You remember that part?
Right.
Okay. are absolutely the opposite of what needs to be done. People need to go outside, outdoors, and of course that's just all common knowledge now that the lockdowns were a bad idea. But back then, everybody was in favor of the lockdowns. All the doctors were saying it's a good idea and so forth. Even Scott Atlas, who made very few mistakes, said we should try the lockdowns because they might work. But of course, I derived everything from first principles and determined that it was a bad idea to lock down healthy people, which is what they did. And so I wrote these guys at Fox and CNN so that I'd have both ends of the political spectrum considering the correct explanation, but none of them wrote me back. Now, I'm not going to blame those 4 individuals because they probably have handlers that are checking their mail every day, and they looked at that and said, forget it.
Absolutely.
But, yeah, I was on top of it from the very beginning.
Absolutely.
I could prove the lockdowns were no good, masks were no good. I had already calculated the correct infection fatality rate. I was the first to do that. It was 0.1%, which turns out to be exactly the infection fatality rate of the flu. And so all this evidence from the very beginning was telling us it was a rebranding. Now, at that time, I didn't know that there was no SARS-2 virus. I figured that out later when the evidence is absolutely airtight that there was no virus. Because remember, there's 3 ways that we can show people that a virus exists. We do it with cytopathic effects, with photography of electron micrographs, and the third way is through genetic sequencing. And with SARS-2, it fails on all 3 levels. No question about it. It's so easy for me to prove. Sitting with a virologist, I could disprove them so quickly. And so I know there was no SARS-2 virus.
Absolutely.
It just didn't exist.
Let's think for a moment that what Robert Kennedy is doing in his position, he's getting eviscerated because of what he's doing. Just give us your professional medical insight thoughts. Is he right? Is he wrong? Where does this lead us? And what is it saying? Literally, what is it telling us based on what he's doing?
Well, he's right on some things. Which along the lines of it needs to be more open, all the science and so forth. It shouldn't be done behind closed doors. He's right about all of that. More transparency, for lack of a better term. But he's wrong sometimes on the science. And I wish he had an advisor like me that could prep him for these Senate hearings, because he could have put those senators in a airtight box if he wanted to, if he'd known more medicine. Now, he's not a doctor, so I'm not complaining or accusing him of anything for not being a doctor. But he needs some advisors that really know what's going on. Now, he's got Marty McCary and Dr. Oz, who are smart men, but they were wrong initially about COVID completely.
Absolutely.
They were in favor of lockdowns and the vaccine and masks, and they didn't know the proper infection fatality rate or any of that. They were wrong on all of it. And I've got quotes in my first book, which is Heroes and Villains, the COVID-19 Book of Lists, from both of those guys on a villain list to show that they were wrong about everything. But again, they were doing their own way of looking at it, and they're just not that rigorous, I guess, is someone like me. So I wish Kennedy would hire me, and I don't know how to get in touch with him, but I could really explain a lot of it to him that he doesn't understand. Let me say one more point about Kennedy. When Bernie Sanders questioned him in that Senate hearing, he asked Kennedy, RFK Jr., if he believed in climate change. And of course, climate change is not man-made. Climate change doesn't exist either. That's right.
Absolutely.
I can prove that in 30 seconds, which I'll do after the break if people are interested in it.
Yeah, very good. Ladies and gentlemen, we're talking with Dr. Reed Sheftall, and we'll be with him right after the news break. Hang in there. Don't turn your dials. We'll be right back right after the news.